Thanks very much, Mike. It's great to be here. I'm here basically because of Jim Steer, who's a great hero of mine. When I was Secretary of State for Transport 10 years ago and was planning HS2 with David Rowland, who alas is no longer with us, Jim was a constant inspiration, and he was ahead of his time in thinking about high-speed rail in Britain, and has been one of the great international pioneers of better transport. And I'm sorry he's not here this evening, but I think his work has been absolutely path-breaking down the years. It's a huge privilege to be here. When I was Secretary of State for Transport, for reasons I can't begin to fathom, they called me the Thing Controller. I've been somewhat distracted of late by other campaigns, namely trying to see that the country isn't towed into the mid-Atlantic and leave Europe. Which is just as well, because when I do peer at what's going on in transport and I see my successor, but 5 as Transport Secretary, I don't much like what I see, to be quite frank. Indeed, my line, which is my warm-up line when I do my Brexit meetings, which I now do up and down the country all the time, which I can tell you always brings the house down, is the one thing that the Prime Minister could do to unite the country at the moment would be to dismiss Chris Grayling. So that gives you some sense of what I think of my successor, but 5. I know it's a normal thing to be very nice about your successors. I'm nice about all my successors, but him. But I think he's done a very poor job, except insofar as his continued policies that were started 10 years ago, like HS2 and Crossrail. Even that one isn't being successfully delivered, and so on. So I don't think things are in a great state. But I have got a very acute perspective on it, because the 2 periods in my life when I've really very, very intensively travelled the railway network are when I was Secretary of State at the beginning, actually when I was Minister of State, at the beginning, the first thing I did, to the consternation of my officials, was to take off on a round Britain rail tour. And I didn't take any officials with me, which my private office didn't like at all. And I didn't even tell them where I was going, which really worried the train companies. You can imagine what they felt about what was going to happen as I went round alone. I mean, but sort of news leaked out because journalists tracked me down and things of this kind. But I was largely on my own. And there's no better way, in my experience of managing public services, of understanding how they work than not just mystery shopping, which I think most managers do, but very, very intensive use of a service, because that then gets, over a short period of time, which gets a whole load of impressions in your mind. And the other time I've done it is now, because at the moment I'm literally going up and down the country at the moment campaigning against Brexit. I do 5 or 6 big public meetings a week, and because of course this Brexit thing is national, I'm constantly on the train, and so I've got a very interesting snapshot of what's happening now and what's happening 10 years ago. And I have to tell you that my main reflection on it is that, with a few isolated exceptions, which are very big station projects, nothing much has changed. It's very depressing. Our stations have not improved. They've got notably worse, but they certainly haven't improved. There have been minor changes, not major changes. There are a few more coffee shops, but not much else. And you remember when my rail round Britain Rail tour, one of the things that caused consternation was when I was at Southampton, I think it was at 8 o'clock in the evening, you couldn't get a cup of tea. This is one of England's major stations, and there were no facilities open on the station at all. The bit that wasn't written up, actually, so I did a blog as I went around, is at the other end of that journey was Brighton, where I arrived, which is a brilliant station redevelopment, where there was an M&S open at 11:30 at night, which was acting as a hub for the station, with a lot of people coming onto Brighton station in order to go to the M&S, which is keeping it alive and vibrant, and so on. But my reflection on the last 10 years is that we haven't really made much progress, to my great regret. We've had a few good big projects which have been successful. Birmingham New Street has opened, Reading has opened, and King's Cross. But they've been a handful, and there are just as many disaster areas as continuing disaster areas as there are successes. I mean, Manchester Piccadilly is a real disgrace as a station, both exits and entrance, getting to and from transport interchanges, getting in and out of the station. The state of the station itself is not great. And I could go down a list of stations where that's still true, unfortunately. And I think the underlying problems haven't changed, which is the biggest one, as I see it, is that there isn't anybody whose prime job, because my view of public services, indeed almost everything you do in life, is unless there's somebody whose prime job is to put them right and who wakes up in the morning and this is what they worry about, things don't happen. The thing I was most concerned about when I got into stations 10 years ago is that Network Rail, which owns our infrastructure, didn't then have anybody whose responsibility was to do stations. Now, Mike himself, actually, I think I may have made his... Where is he? I may have made your career, I don't know. He became the first director of stations for Network Rail, which is great. That was fantastic. But the fact he's no longer doing it is a sign that, and it'd be interesting to know who is a sign of things that aren't really... He's doing it back there. Well, I look forward to hearing how this discussion goes, but hereafter, and what has happened. But my own view, for what it's worth, is that stations shouldn't be the development of stations as social and retail centres shouldn't be the responsibility of Network Rail, but should be given to a freestanding organisation, and the government should vest the assets, the station assets, apart from the track, of course, in this new entity. I thought that 10 years ago. Most of the things that I thought 10 years ago, which I didn't do, I now regret not having done. I was persuaded by my officials not to do it, which I think was a mistake. I should have done it, and I think if we'd done it, things would have been better. And all of the things that there isn't, as I reflected on what I was going to say today, the inspiration, because I've always had this view, when I was Secretary of State and was in China looking at high-speed rail, courtesy actually of Jim in part, a senior British businessman in China said to me, where of course the whole all kinds of members there, the Chinese Minister of Transport, who in one of these dinners that went on to about 2 o'clock in the morning after 15 different toasts of Bao Tai, where our ambassador said the thing you have to do is to substitute the water for the Bao Tai, so you just drink from the water, and I told you, you'd be literally under the table by the time comes to the 13th toast. But at about this the 5th or 6th toast, the Chinese Minister of Transport said, Lord Adonis, we want to build HS2 for you, he said. Whatever the Germans quote, he said, we'll do it for half the price. He said, we have all their technology, he said. So we know how to do it. I said, that's very, very kind of you. I said, but I still haven't got my plans through this institution we have called Parliament, I said, which, does actually take decisions, and it's not a foregone conclusion what it would do and all that. I said, but come, I said, and we have an election coming up. So when these things, trying to explain to him elections and parliaments and things like this. So I said, but come to me in 5 years' time if I'm still in this post, which of course I wasn't. My successor, but 3 was in post then, because that's the way we run this country. We change our transport secretary every year, except for Chris Grayling, who seems to have managed to be longer than all of them. So it's success in its duration in inverse proportion to competence. But anyway, I said to him, come to me in 5 years' time, and I'll tell you whether we can do this or not. And so we dropped that conversation. He is now in prison under suspended sentence of death for corruption, as are all of the officials I dealt with at the time, which does tell you the difference between an autocracy and democracy. But I remember it was a senior British businessman at this, when I was visiting there, discussing all this with, who said to me, you need to understand that in China, R&D stands for rob and duplicate, which is true, not least in railway technology and all that. However, it's always stuck in my mind because it's also a golden rule of public policy. There are very, very few new ideas out there. There's some new technologies which apply things, but mostly what happens is learning from success. The critical thing is to work out what's worked and what's failed. And many policymakers learn the wrong things from them. Brexit is a classic example of, as a country, we are learning from abject lessons of failure, not from lessons of success. We should learn from success. I've always, in all the jobs I've done, I've tried as honestly as I can to learn from success and things that have really worked. Now, the 3 huge successes in station developments, I've thought, which I have had in my mind when I commissioned Chris Green and Peter Hall. And alas, Peter Hall is one of the most talented city planners of his generation. Alas, is no longer with us either. Is Chris here? He's not here this evening, is he? By chance. But Chris is a very, very great man too. The 3 successes that stuck in my mind then haven't been improved on since, actually, to my regret. And can I tell you what they are? Because they stick in my mind as successes, which you should do. The first was St Pancras, which is the only station redevelopment that has turned a station into a really successful and vibrant social centre in its own right. And it is no accident, to my mind, that it was not developed by Network Rail. It was not developed by an engineering group and a transport company. It was developed by London and Continental, who saw it from the outset as being a state-of-the-art and really cutting-edge placemaking exercise linking into the wider community. A third of the people who go to St Pancras, including myself a lot of the time, aren't even going to get on or off a train, interestingly. Now, when I compare that with King's Cross next door, St Pancras is out of all which of course is later, St Pancras is out of all proportion better than King's Cross. And you can tell just by going around the two stations that one was developed by somebody who was interested in placemaking, the other was developed by Network Rail and a transport undertaking. King's Cross is almost devoid of retail. Retail is an add-on. There's massive amounts of wasted space there, which is and including large amounts of really potentially significant space that could be used for placemaking, which is just sealed off. It's all run as a transport undertaking, with the retail being an add-on, whereas St Pancras, building the place and integrating the place and the wider purposes which a station could exist for with the transport, has been at the core. However, that leads to my second one. My second model always has been the Victoria Line. The Victoria Line was an amazing development in the 60s and 70s. It showed what we were capable of doing when we really concentrated our engineering and prowess on one project. Indeed, it's an interesting one. I've never read a proper history of Victoria and why it's been so successful. It was automatic train operation, decades before it was done anywhere else on the network. It was very intensive running of trains with intensive turnback facilities, all those things long before they applied elsewhere on the network. But the other thing it had, which to my mind is so central, because one of my concerns when I was Transport Secretary, and it still is, and my wider concern, is always to put the user at the centre of a public service. The Victoria Line, I don't know who it was who designed the interchanges on the Victoria Line, but the interchanges are brilliant. All of those literally cross-platform interchanges was what must have happened with a big redesign of the tunnelling of the associated lines, the Northern Line and the Bakerloo Line. So that for the passenger, the Victoria Line is brilliant. It has excellent access and egress facilities. It has the platforms as close to the surface as possible, consistent, I assume, with all the other geological and other things that are required. And then all of the key interchanges are literally across platform. So that, and for those who are nerds, and there'll be lots of nerds in the room as I look around, I can see quite a few of you at the moment, the time it takes to interchange, the number of steps it takes, all of those are crucial to the passenger experience. No one has yet bettered the Victoria Line in any development since. And actually, a prime offender actually is St Pancras, which is brilliant as a social centre, but terrible as a transport interchange. The interchange between Thameslink and the Victoria Line on the old King's Cross station, King's Cross St Pancras station, which was literally one escalator and one corridor, was 10 minutes less than it often takes actually now to get from the Thameslink to get to the Victoria Line. To get from the Thameslink to the Victoria Line now, you have to go up 2 escalators even to get to a level. You have to walk across the whole of the concourse of St Pancras Station. You have to, depending on which of the ticket halls you go down, you have to go down another, across a big concourse, another down past the plaque where I reopened the Northern Concourse, which you must stop and admire as you go past. You then go down 2 further escalators. You have a hugely long corridor, and then you come down to the stations. You might as well describe it as 2 separate stations for the purposes of this, and I'm afraid all those lessons have not been learnt by Crossrail. It was too late for me to stop it. When I looked at the plans of Crossrail, the interchanges are absolutely terrible and are going to involve very long walks and all that. So that no one has improved on the Victoria Line. The third one, no one has improved on, as heritage restoration, which is a very important part of stations because these are big historic artefacts as well. No one has yet improved, including at King's Cross, on the Chiltern Line restorations. The restoration of London Marylebone and the Birmingham stations is exemplary. I don't think it would be possible to better it. Marylebone is now restored almost to the condition that it was when the Great Central opened in 1899, but with good and modern facilities, actually, as part of it as well. And the King's Cross isn't anything like as good. I mean, I know something of the history of these things in terms of the meticulous restoration of the original station and so on. So what is my message to you is that we've made some progress. We've done some very big projects since. We haven't got any systematic plan for upgrading our stations. We still have a big problem that it's no one's prime responsibility. And 10 years after I commissioned the report, no one has yet bettered on the models that I had in my mind, which inspired me to ask Chris and Peter to do their report. But other than that, everything's fine. Thanks very much.